Well, it's good to see you all again here at this conference. It's my third time to this conference, my fourth trip to Australia. And good night, Mike. Good to see you again. Well, we begin this evening a series of Elisha. Now, if you were with us 5 years ago, we considered Elijah. And if you remember the title of that series, we had a kind of catchy title, A Man Like Us for a Time Like Ours. And maybe you're thinking, well, all right, we've already been through that, a man like us in a time like ours, and at the same time period, because Elisha, as we just read, followed right on the heels of Elijah. So why do we need to continue this theme? I think it's worth addressing that for just a moment and to consider what's so great about Elisha, and why would we put a focus, a spotlight on this man and consider his predecessor, his forerunner, Elijah. And the difference might be put like this. Elijah was kind of like a shooting star who came out of nowhere, flashed across the heavens, and then went back up into the heavens, in fact, in a chariot of fire. Whereas Elisha was more like our sun, who lingered and shines more brightly for a longer period and gives warmth. Where Elijah was such a burning and shining light for a short time, Elisha carried on a heartwarming ministry from his youth up to his old age. And he served for his whole life as a prophet of the living God, steadily, steadfastly, faithfully, continually. And he served not only as a young man, as we see him here in this passage, start of his ministry at the feet of Elijah, the great prophet, but he served until he was an old man, even on his deathbed. And so, in a way, there's something for all of us here. We have some here who are very young. And, well, Elisha wasn't quite as young as a lad. He was old enough to be a farm laborer doing heavy work there, as we see him in this scene at the end of chapter 19. But there are some of us here who can perhaps quite relate to Elisha when he gets to the very end and he's on his deathbed, and we'll consider that the Lord's Day. So stay with us, even those of you who have some gray hairs, as I am sporting at the moment. And they're real, they're not dyed. I've earned them. Well, there's something for us too. Are you going to be faithful like this Elisha? Are you going to carry serving this great king even when weakness sets in and you feel like all I'm good for is to lie here on my deathbed? And yet Elisha was still faithfully serving his Lord, his God, even on his deathbed. So as I say, there's something for all of us here. And in those middle years, where we'll also consider some little snippets of events in Elisha's life, there's something for those of you in between as well. Something for all of us. And I pray, and it has been my prayer as I've considered coming here this third trip to your conference, that God bless, and as fire fell on Mount Carmel and consumed that sacrifice, as was prayed earlier, that Elijah had prepared, that fire would come from heaven, not literally, but that God's presence would come upon us here in this gathering. Know and cry with heart conviction, the Lord, He is God. And that this would stir our hearts, not just to have some kind of emotional experience here at this camp, but stir our hearts to serve Him all our days with vigor, with energy, in good times, and yes, in bad times, as we'll see also in the life of Elisha. Well, let's begin with a bit of an overview of the times, just going back, if you remember 5 years ago, which I don't that well, but so it's good for me to review if it's not for you, what it was like in Elisha's day as well as Elijah's day. Well, you just recall what we saw then, and if you weren't here, or if you've forgotten, like many of us, what it was like. It was a time of continued rebellion, downgrade, of rejection of the God of Israel, who had called Israel Egypt, delivered them, redeemed them, made them his own, blessed them in so many ways, and yet they had turned their back on this great, gracious, faithful, loving, true, and living God for what? Baal. Now, the word Baal is simply a Hebrew and Aramaic word that means Lord or Master. So they called Master to an object that they had themselves made. And as we have that satirical description in Isaiah, I believe it is, where they take one piece of the tree and carve an idol and bow down to it and call it their God, and the other piece of the tree they burn and they cook their meal over it, and they eat their meal and they bow down to the other half and worship it, and how foolish that is. Well, that's where Israel was when Elisha is there behind his oxen plowing in the field. The king was wicked. Ahab is still on the throne. The queen was worse, and as we saw in the beginning of this chapter, Elijah, after the great victory on Mount Carmel, faces the threat. Queen, he faced 450 prophets, slaughters them in the valley, and now one woman utters a threat, and Elijah runs into the wilderness. That's the situation in Israel. This woman, Jezebel, had been behind the death of most of the prophets of Jehovah, of the Lord. 50 had been hidden in caves, or 100 had been hidden in 2 caves by 50s. But most prophets of the Lord had been slaughtered at the command of Jezebel. So in a way, you can't blame Elijah. This woman utters a threat. It's for some reason that it's not just an idle threat. It has teeth to it. He runs to the wilderness, and there God meets with him, as we just read. Well, that's the situation. What's God going to do? Is it all over? Do we Israel down the tubes? We feel like sometimes our own society is about to be flushed, and we might as well just throw it away. It's that bad? Just give up on it? Well, God wasn't done yet. And you see, here's Elijah, he's not past his due date yet. He's still got more work to do. But God recognizes that Elijah is not going to be on the scene forever, as we recognize with our gray beards. That there needs to be another generation of prophets who are going to carry the message and proclaim the word boldly to Israel. And so here in the end of chapter 19, God gives Elijah more marching orders and tells him, as part of his marching orders, to anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, as his successor, as his helper. So that's a kind of an introduction to this whole series. Why study Elisha? Well, if Elijah was a man like us for a time like ours, in a sense, Elisha is even more like us. We're not just flashes of a shooting star in the sky. I hope that we'll still be here for a few more years and want to be faithful even unto death. Well, let's consider now. We're going to start. Here's just a little preview. We're going to start with Elisha as a student. I know we have students here. I'm convinced of that. And we have some seniors here. We'll start with a student, go through several events in Elisha's ministry, and we'll end with that last senior moment of Elisha on his deathbed. So that's our program for these together. Let's begin with the call of Elisha. Now, we start with 3 points here. God directs Elijah, and then God prepares Elisha. There's work of preparation before Elijah comes on the scene and meets him there in the field. And then the third is Elisha follows the Lord. So let's just read these let's read just a few snippets here. Verse 15 and then 19 to 21 again. Verse 15, and the Lord said to him, to Elijah, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu, verse 16 also, and Jehu the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint king over Israel. And here, Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. Now verse 19. So he departed from there and found the son of Shaphat while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed over to him and threw his mantle on him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, Please, let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow you. And he said to him, Go back again, for what of you? So he returned from following him and took the pair of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the implements of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and ministered to him. So God directs Elijah, verse 16 and 17. And you see, this is part of Elijah's restoration. As I said earlier, God wasn't finished with Elijah. God had more work for him to do. And part of that program includes anointing three men. He wants to anoint for the judgment of Israel, Jehu, the son of Nimshi. He's going to slay multitudes in Israel. That's for judgment. Judgment on the house of Ahab. The wicked king Ahab needs to be judged. Who's going to do that? You shall anoint you king over Israel. And remember, Jehu wiped out the house of Ahab and Jezebel and cast her down to be eaten by dogs. And then he's going to anoint Elisha as prophet in his place. So that's his task. And so now we find, and we're going to focus now on Elisha. Leave Elijah behind, not totally. He's going to be in the background. We're going to focus on Elisha. Now, Elijah leaves, it says, it just puts it very briefly in verse 19. So he departed from there and found Elisha. Now, that's a handful of words in our Bibles, but we have to remember, where is Elijah when he gets this command, go anoint Elisha? Elijah, we go back and we find in verse 8, at Horeb, the mountain of God. What's the other name for that mountain? Sinai. Now, if you look at Bible maps, Mount Sinai is down near the very tip of the Sinai Peninsula. And it took him 40 days and 40 nights to get there from the southern part of Israel, not down into the Sinai Peninsula. And now Abel Maholah is on the banks of the Jordan River, as most scholars would locate it. They're not exactly sure, but it's up in the middle of the hill country of Ephraim, but not in the hills, down in the Jordan Valley. And the name Abel Maholah means the meadow of dancing. Now, when you place the meadow of dancing, that probably means it's a fairly pleasant place to live. And so this journey, and as I just roughly, go along the scale of miles and kilometers in my Bible map, it's something shy of 3 kilometers from Mount Sinai back up to Abel Maholah. This we read. So he departed from there and found Elisha. It sounds like, he just hopped over the fence. But it was a long journey. So Elijah had a lot of time to think about this. And we come now to Maholah. Well, let's think at this point of God preparing Elisha before Elijah even ever shows up on the scene. What did God do to prepare this young farmer boy, because that's what he is, he's a farm boy, to prepare him for Elijah suddenly coming on the scene, casting a mantle over his shoulders and expecting that Elisha is going to know what this means? This isn't out of the blue. There had to be some kind of work of preparation to bring Elisha to the point of readiness for this. Well, let's think, first of all, consider his parents. Now, it doesn't mention much. It just says he's the son of Shaphat. But from the brief few facts that we have, what can we say about his parents? Well, first of all, Shaphat named his son Elisha. Remember, we considered with Elijah that his name had significance. Elijah, Elia, is Hebrew for my God is Yahweh. Now, for a parent to name their son Elijah in a time of Baal worship, when everybody's bowing down to Baal, and that's the preferred religion of the throne, and prophets are having their throats slit, that's a bold statement. What does Elisha mean? Well, we have the same first part of the name, Eli, my God. Shah is a condensation or a contraction of the Hebrew for salvation. Yeshua, Yahweh saves. Elisha, my God saves. My God is salvation. So here again, not Baal saves, but my God saves. Now, who in Israel would be recognized as God, the God of Israel? Well, this is very common language in Hebrew for the true and living God, Jehovah, Yahweh. To say, my God saves, is again a bold statement coming out to proclaim our faith is not in Baal. Our faith is in the God of Israel. So Elijah, my God is Jehovah. Elisha, my God saves. Shaphat was willing to have Baal worshippers heap scorn, maybe even persecution upon, and identified his family with the true and living God. My God saves. So Elisha grew up in a home that was evidently committed to the true and living God. I don't think that's reading too much in between the lines here. Remember the times in which they lived. It was a bold statement. Their hope was not in Baal, but in Jehovah. What else can we learn about his family? Well, we can learn by seeing what Elisha is doing when we meet him first here in verse 19. He parted from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. So what was he doing? He's out plowing. Now his father evidently was a fairly rich farmer because he had at least 12 pairs of oxen. That's 24 if you do the math. And you don't have to be an engineer to do that math. Well, 24 oxen, that means he's got some means. When I was in Kenya in Africa, the farmers there measured their wealth not by how much they had in the bank, but how many cows they had in the field. And here he's got 12 pair of oxen plowing. Now, have you ever seen, I know we're in farm country out here, have you ever seen anybody plow with 12 pair of oxen pulling one plow? It's not done. I mean, how would you coordinate 24 oxen to pull one plow? It's 12 pair of oxen pulling 12 plows. Now that's a pretty big field that he's covering with 12 pairs of oxen plowing. And where is Elisha? He's with the 12th pair. That means he's in the back where he can see what the other 11 are doing. He's in a supervisory role on his father's farm, but he's not just sitting under a tree, eating an apple, or biting his nails. He is doing work as well. What do we learn about his parents from that? Parents? Obviously, they had their son to be a diligent, faithful worker. Here he was with his hands at the plow, not turning back, diligently doing the work that God had given him to do. Now, it was mentioned in the prayer earlier that here he had this, I guess it was when we were praying earlier, he had evidently a desire to serve the Lord, but he wasn't just waiting under some tree somewhere for Elijah to come throw a mantle over him. He was busily engaged in the work that God had given him to do. His parents trained him to work. What else do we learn about his parents from these brief verses? We learn that he was raised in a loving home where he was trained to be respectful, obedient, and to appreciate what his parents had done for him. Now, some children, when they have opportunity to leave the home, it's almost as if it's good riddance. True, I couldn't wait to be out of there. Well, my grandfather told me the story that when he was younger, he left the home in his teens because he couldn't get away from his father. In fact, he told me that he wanted to grow up and be bigger than his dad so he could come back and beat him up. But he never did get bigger than his father, so he never fulfilled his ambition. Well, that was obviously not Elisha's case. He grew up in a home where there was a good relationship and there was respect for his parents. You see what he says? He says, please, let me kiss my father and my mother. Let me show them that affection and that respect which is their due, and then I will follow you. He was respectful and gracious to his parents. Now, Elijah is a kind of a figure. I'm not blaming Elijah's parents, but Elijah was that austere, bold prophet. But as we consider the life of Elisha, we see him interacting with the woman who was childless, and we see him when her child dies, and how he was gracious to the sons of the prophets when the axe head falls off, and when their pot of their stew is poisoned, and he's so gracious to them and sensitive to their needs. He was obviously raised in a home where consideration for others was taught to him. But furthermore, I think this is a very important thing that we learn about his upbringing. He was trained and taught, and of course God blessed that training and teaching, to obey and to trust the Lord. Now, parents cannot guarantee that by faithful upbringing of our children, they will automatically be saved. We recognize the hand of a sovereign God. And even the most faithful parents among us, when our children are converted, we can only say, thank you, Lord. Bless our faithful and sometimes often failing efforts to raise our children in the fear of the Lord. And so I'm not saying that it was automatic by any means. But obviously, Elisha had learned at his knees to respect the word of the Lord, and God had graciously used that to bring him to, in his own heart, trust, believe, follow, and serve this Lord. And even following the oxen. He's not doing that, as it were, just as a means to make a living. He's following his oxen and plowing a straight furrow is even in preparation for greater service. And so when Elijah comes on the scene and casts his mantle on, he doesn't say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I got to think this over. I got to do the math here. This is, I don't know, this looks dicey, or whatever an Australian term would be. I'm not sure about this whole thing. He is ready to follow. Where does that come from? His parents had trained him that when God calls, you answer. And God graciously owned that training in his case. Again, it's not it. And let me add here, it doesn't mean that if you were raised by parents who didn't love God and you start the game, as it were, with two strikes against you in the Christian life because your parents gave you miserable training, it doesn't mean it's hopeless. Because God's grace override and overcome even bad parental example and training. That's how great God's grace is. We also recognize that gracious upbringing, molding of a child's character in godly ways, goes a long way in preparation. When God's grace comes and owns that, it produces men like Charles Spurgeon. Not only godly parents, godly grandparents, a goodly heritage, reading his grandfather's pure volumes as a child, memorizing hymns because his grandmother paid him a half a penny for every hymn he memorized, until his grandfather paid him a penny for every rat he killed, and he realized he could make more money killing rats than memorizing hymns. But what a heritage, and what does it produce in God's blessing? Well, here we have an Elisha, molded by such parents, such influence. Parents. Of course, we have to cry to God that He'll bless our training, He'll own our example, He'll take that teaching and not just pound it into the brains of our children, but bring it to their hearts. But parents, you need to be faithful. Don't give up on your children. Don't just say, well, God's sovereign. If He's going to save him, He's going to save him. Bring them up as Paul admonishes us in the fear, in the training, in the admonition. That's the teaching, verbal reproof and correction of the Lord. And pray that God will own it and mold them and shape them. Pastor Martin, in his preaching on the life of Elisha, put it this way. You need to, and he put a lot more into it than we have time to give to this sermon. But he said we need to raise our kids with a tight fist, or a tight rein. Now that was the phrase. A tight rein and an open hand. What's a tight rein? That means we mold them carefully. Protect them, guard them from evil influence. But the open hand, why? Because when it came time, they let them go. They let Elisha go. And didn't say, oh no, son, that's too dangerous. Oh no, son, if you become a prophet of Jehovah, you could get killed doing that. Reminds me of John Peyton when he went to be a missionary to the New Hebrides, and one old Scottish elder said to him, but don't you know? You could be eaten by cannibals. It's dangerous to be a missionary. Dear young Mr. Peyton answered, sir, you will be eaten by worms. It's dangerous to serve Jehovah. You could get yourself killed. You could be mocked. You would be made fun of in the office, in school. Elisha didn't bat an eye. And his parents didn't bat an eye. An open hand, son. God's call. That God used you. It doesn't say that in our Bibles. I'm not quoting the words. But as we can see these hints of what kind of parents Elisha had, they let him go. Let me go kiss my father and mother. And you can just picture the scene. He comes in and he says, Mom and Dad, Elisha came and he threw his mantle on me. And what did they say? I don't know anything but that. Son, is it reading too much into the text? I don't believe it is. A name like Elisha? Son, we believe that God is salvation. Our God saves. And if God's going to save, He uses His Word. Son, be a prophet of the Most High God. Praise His name. Parents, you raise your children that way. But son, I had this vision. I wanted to be a doctor and make $1 million. I'm not going to get rich being a pastor. I'm not going to get rich being a missionary. Parents, would you rejoice to have a son, daughter, serving Christ? Would you? Let them go. I told my parents. We told Carol's parents. We were going to the Philippines. There were tears shed. We'd be on the other side of the world. But there was joy in the heart. Thank God for our parents. Kids. Maybe your parents have a tight rein. And they give you chores to do, and they give you jobs around the house. And you say, well, wait a minute, my friend Johnny, he's out playing. I want to go and play. And they say, no, you got to finish this. You got to play your toys first. You got to clean your room. You got to put out the garbage. You got to feed the cat. You got to finish your homework. Then you can play. You chafe. You say, no, I want to go and play. You wouldn't do that. Thank God for parents, like the parents of Elisha, who give you that training you need. May God bless it for your good. Don't be angry. Don't be mad. Don't chafe at it. But thank God for it. That was just the first point. God preparing Elisha. What did Elisha do? Now let's turn the focus on Elisha. That was about his parents. Elisha follows the Lord. Now, what did Elisha do? Let's again go back to the picture. Now here's Elisha plowing away. He's got 11 pairs of oxen in front of him, and he's with the 12th. And maybe they're doing every 12th row. I can't kind of get the picture. It must have been a huge field, and 11 pair of oxen before him. He's with the 12th. And here, boldly marching onto the scene, here comes Elijah. Comes over the fence, if they've got a fence, comes marching across the plowed land, and he comes right up to Elisha, and maybe all the guys are kind of looking over their shoulder and trying to plow a straight furrow at the same time. And here's this guy, and he's got this hairy robe on. And everybody knows who this wild man Elijah is. He comes marching right up. Oxen kind of plow slowly, as I would imagine. I've never been a farm boy. And throws his mantle right on the back of the boss's son, Elisha. I would think, and I don't think it's too much imagination, they just stopped what they were doing. Huh? What's this? And Elisha looks at him, but everybody knows exactly what this means. Elijah throwing his over the shoulders of Elisha means only one thing. You the man. I'm calling you to follow me and be my servant and my helper. Passing the mantle, passing the responsibility, putting it on his shoulders. What's he going to do? What's his response? It's like Jesus, you remember, and he goes past where Simon and Andrew and James and John are mending their nets after a day of fishing. And he says, follow me, you. What do? They leave their nets and get up, follow Jesus. It's the same kind of picture. Follow me. And what does he do? He gets up and he runs after Elijah. Right then and there. I mean, it's kind of it's just typical Elijah, isn't it? Just like he appears on the scene and goes to King Ahab and says, there's not going to be any rain for these days, these years, except by my word, and then he marches off. He comes now, he throws his mantle over Elisha's shoulders, and he starts marching off. Oh, wait a minute here. He knows. Runs after him. Now, of course, our call to follow Christ is not going to come in exactly the same way. We're not going to have anybody come and throw a mantle over us. But this can be the only response you see from a heart of a child. When God calls, you don't say, let me think about it. You don't say, well, wait a minute here. This is a big, kind of a big issue. When it's clear that God makes His will known, there's only one thing for a genuine Christian to do, and that's to say, here I am. Send me. Immediate submission is what we see in the heart of Elisha. God calls. He says, here am I. I'm bought with a price. I'm not my own. I belong to another. Elisha, my God is salvation. If He's my salvation, I'm going to follow where He leads. And so, what does he do next? It's kind of a touching scene, isn't it? He left the oxen and ran after Elijah, verse 20, and said, Please let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow you. Now, does that remind you of anything? Here he is, following the plow, and he turns back. Turns to follow Elijah. But then, following Elijah, he says, wait a minute, let me go kiss my parents. And he turns from following Elijah. Does that remind you of anything? Let's just turn, because I'm sure it does. Let's turn to Luke chapter 9. Luke 9, 61 and 62. I'm sure many of you have this in your thoughts. Well, is that turning back? Isn't that wrong? Turning back to say goodbye to his parents? Didn't Jesus have something to say about that? Well, he's talking about those who follow half-heartedly or for wrong motives. And he says here in Luke 9:61, also said, I will follow you, Lord, but first permit me to say goodbye to those at home. But Jesus said to him, no one, after putting his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God. First permit me to say goodbye. Isn't that exactly what Elisha is doing? Let me go kiss my mother and then I'll follow you. Isn't that like almost a direct quote? Well, seems very similar, doesn't it? What's the difference? Why does Elijah say to Elisha in a gracious way, what did I do to you? Go ahead. In other words, what have I done to prevent you from being gracious parents? Go ahead. Elijah gives permission. Why? What's the difference? Well, obviously, Jesus is talking to a young man who is looking for a way out. I'll follow you, Lord, but first, looking for a way out. Is he looking for a way out of following Elijah? Not at all. Elisha is determined to follow Elijah, but he's determined to show respect and love to his parents who raised him in a loving home before he goes. And so Elijah gives the permission. And so he turns back. And you can think of the scene, although it doesn't say anything about it in our text. He comes to his mom and dad, perhaps even with some tears of longing, of love for them, thinking of what the parting will mean to them. Here's their son who's been helpful on the farm, and he's going to leave his aging parents, and what that means to them. And he tells them, Mom, Dad, Elijah the prophet came and he threw his mantle, and maybe he's still got the mantle on his shoulders, and he comes in and what's this, son? It's Elijah's. And he's called me. He wants me to follow him. And I want to, Mom and Dad, and I think it's the right, God is calling me. And they give him their blessing. It's evident that they do so from the events that follow. Maybe his father said, Son, why are you here early? Is the plowing finished yet? No, son. No, Dad. But Elijah came. And this kiss that he gives them, you can almost picture the scene of Paul there leaving the Ephesian elders there at the dockside when he departs, and they fall on his neck, weeping at the thought that they would see him no more. We have no news that Elisha ever got back to Abel Mahola. Maybe he did. But his parents knew he wasn't going to be a farm boy any longer. Kiss of separation. The tears, perhaps that flowed. They let him go. He's gracious to his parents. But then we find the of renunciation. And I believe that was Pastor Martin's title for this section. What does he do with his oxen? Well, it's kind of strange. He returned from following him, took the pair of oxen, and sacrificed them. And here again, he had to have his dad's permission to do this, his dad's blessing, because they're not his oxen, they're his oxen. And he takes them and sacrifices them, and boiled their flesh. And what did he use to cook the meat? He burned the yoke, the implements of the oxen. What's that? Now, they didn't have iron to use for tools in those days. The yoke would have been made of wood. So he takes this wooden yoke that would have been shaped and carved out of a substantial piece of timber that was used to put the two oxen together so that they would pull the plow in union, in harmony, breaks it up as kindling wood, builds a fire with it, puts it under the oxen he's roasting, or boiling rather, under the big pot. And you can see now he invites the neighbors. It says he gave to the people. So he calls the neighbors. He's got, of course, 12 workers, 11 other workers that are helping him on the farm. They come, and maybe they bring their families, the workers, the helpers on the farm, neighbors, because it's a whole ox. I mean, you don't have an oxen when you have a dinner for two, right? And the whole family, aunts, uncles, and they gather and they say, "Oh, what's the occasion? Oh, that smells good. What, you kill a cow?" "No, they're my two oxen." "Huh? Oh, they must have broken a leg, right? Right, Elisha? You had two oxen go lame. That's a shame." "No, they didn't go lame." "Huh? Oh, two good oxen? Weren't they your favorite? They're the ones you always plow with? What did you do that for?" "Well, I'm going to serve the Lord Jehovah. I'm going to follow Prophet Elijah." "Huh?" Here again, he is like Cortez, who brought his fleet to the New World and he burned his ships so his men wouldn't mutiny and go back to Spain. He was committed. It's a fire renouncing past life as a farm boy, a plowboy. He's not going to turn back. You see, he's not putting his hand to the plow and saying, "Oh, well, okay, today I'll be a prophet, tomorrow if it gets too tough, I'm going back. I can always go back to being a farm boy if this prophet business doesn't work out. Maybe it's not going to pay much. Maybe I'll get rich. Maybe it's going to be a little too hard. Maybe somebody's going to call me old bald head. And I won't like being called bald head. It hurts to be called bald head. Forget about it. I'm going back to my plow." No. You're not called bald head, by the way. We have time to look at that incident. But must have hurt. I don't like, getting called bald head. I've been called worse. He didn't turn back. He wasn't going to turn back. He was going to follow the call of the Lord. Now, we don't get called the same way, of course. We don't have anybody, I didn't have anybody come and throw a mantle over my shoulders and say, you're the next prophet, you're the next preacher boy. But God makes His calling in various means, with desire, with gifts that He gives, with the recognition of God's faithful people who encourage and urge, and God makes it clear, one way or the other, if God calls, you keep the back door open. Well, maybe if this doesn't work out, we can always go back. Or you're determined to do what God has called you to do. And may I speak to the young men here? May it be that God will raise up Elisha. We're not going to go, us older men, are not going to go around throwing our jackets on anybody, because that's not our business. We're not Elijah. We're not given direct revelation like Elijah was to go cast our mantle on any one of you. But if God makes it giving you gifts, giving you desire, you're determined to follow. Here I am. Send me. No turning back. No turning back. Demas followed Paul, served Paul for a while. With pain, I'm sure he had tears in his eyes when he penned the words. When he spoke them to his writer, Demas has left me, having loved this present world. Will you follow no matter what? That was Elisha. But then there's this feast again of confession. He's telling his friends, he's telling his neighbors. He's not going to hide it. He's not saying, well, here's a little feast, but I'm going to go away for a little while. And no. Remember another New Testament parallel to this, where there's a man who is called out of darkness in his case, and he's now going to be one of the 12, and he gives a feast. Who is that? Matthew, or Levi, his other name. He has a feast. And who does he invite to the feast? Tax collectors and sinners. Is Matthew hiding the fact that he's now a follower of Jesus? No. Is Elisha hiding the fact that he's a follower of Elijah and of God? No. Elisha is making it clear, I am a follower of King Jehovah. Then there's this departure. After all of this, what does Elisha do? So he returned from following him and took the pair of oxen, sacrificed their flesh with the implements of the oxen, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and ministered to him. Followed Elijah and did what? Became a big shot prophet boy with his red lights. Come here, Elisha the prophet. No. He ministered to Elijah. You know what that means? He was a minister. The word minister just means servant. He served. What to be a servant of Elijah? Well, let's just turn to 2 Kings 3:11. We get a little picture how he started out in this prophet business. 2 Kings chapter 3. And Jehoshaphat is looking for a prophet of Jehovah, and all the king of Israel has to offer on scene are prophets of prophets. And Jehoshaphat said, is there not a prophet of Jehovah, of the Lord here? Verse 11 of chapter 3 of 2 Kings, that we may inquire of the Lord by him? And one of the king of Israel's servants answered and said, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. How did he get started in the prophet business? Elijah said, come here, I'm going to wash my hands, pour the water. And so Elisha's holding the pitcher, pouring the water, because they didn't have faucets, they didn't have sinks. He's pouring the water over Elijah's hands while the prophet washes his hands. This is menial work. Couldn't you just hire somebody? Couldn't you just get in the ordinary Tom, Dick, or Harry to do the work? Sure he could. What's he teaching Elisha? It's like Jesus had to teach his disciples. Who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? You know the answer? The greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the one who gives the orders. The big shot. The greatest is the one who serves. And so when we follow the ministry of Elisha, we find him with a servant's heart, serving the people. We find him willing to help the sons of the prophets in their time of need. When one of the women is so poor, who's a prophet died, and she's about to sell her kids into slavery to pay the bills. Well, look at that incident. Elisha has compassion. Where does she run? She goes to Elisha. He's a servant prophet. There's good training for a pastor. Some want to kind of leapfrog the process and get into the big time first. No, young men, take your time in the wilderness. Do the work of service. Humble service. God likes to choose and use humble servants to give him glory. Those who look to glory for themselves, God doesn't bless that. Remember old Robert Murray McShane? Speaking of those who are humble, those who are lowly, not great gifts that God blesses, so much as great likeness to Jesus. A holy man is a mighty instrument in the hands of God. A holy man is a humble man. God is training Elisha. He follows him to be a servant. First years of his ministry. How long did he do this? Well, Elisha doesn't seem as greatly useful for some time. He's trained in this work of lowly service. Now, what are the lessons we learn as we bring to a conclusion? By the way, it's not quite the end yet, so don't close your Bibles. When I say we'll come to our conclusions, those are lessons that we need to draw from the theme as we looked at this opening event in Elisha's ministry. What does it mean, first of all, to be a Christian? We find not just the cost of being a minister, a pastor, a missionary. That's not the only thing illustrated here. It's an illustration of the cost of true discipleship. What does it mean to be a Christian? To be a Christian means to be a disciple. What's a disciple? A disciple is a follower. Now, disciple means student, really. But the idea of student in our day, as a student, we think of university students, and at least maybe back in my generation, they were protesters. See, I was in college. My first year of college was still Vietnam War days. And students were protesting. March on Washington! And when that was over, they protested tuition increases. With tuition increases. And students were known for rallies and protests and anti-this and anti-that. Well, that's not, you see, what it is to be a disciple. To be a disciple of Jesus is to be a follower. It means what the Master says, that's what we follow. That's what we do. There was a bumper sticker I saw some 25 years ago in the United States. It was a National Association of National Educators Association, NEA. It was a union of teachers. And this bumper sticker said, question authority, NEA. That's what teachers wanted to teach young people, question authority. If I was a kid and my teacher said to me, question authority, I would say to him, who are you to tell me to question authority? That's what he's leading to. He wouldn't like it. You see, that's the idea that we have here. That's not what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. To be a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jehovah, is to say, Master, speak. Your servant hears. It's to say, here I am, Lord, send me. It's to say, I'm not my own. I'm bought with a price. I'm going to glorify God in my body. And I don't often use myself as an illustration, so I'll kind of just put me to the side, but think of this as out of my own experience. I remember, and I don't lift myself up as a great example here, but let me just tell you this story. I was getting ready to go to the Philippines, way back, much younger than today. And a man in our church back in New Jersey said to me, I don't know how you could do that, be a missionary. I said to him, well, I'm a Christian, When it was clear to me that that was God's call, what do you do? Yes, Lord. And a Christian is going to say yes to his master. Yes, that's what it means to be a Christian. God may call you to follow oxen. God may call you to be an engineer. God may call you to be a ditch digger or a garbage man. But you want to do it for His glory. And you see, to be a Christian means whatever is you in God's will, in God's Word. You say, yes, Lord. And here's Elisha. And it's very clear because Elijah the prophet, obeying the word of Jehovah, go anoint Elisha as prophet in your place. He goes and he throws his mantle on him. Elisha has no doubt what it means. What's he going to say? He says, sir, yes, sir. That's the call of my God. That's what I'm going to do. So, here again, I say this is what it means to be a Christian. When God makes it clear what is His will in your life, and we're not just talking about vocation. We're talking about basic Christian living. Well, is it really God's will for me to give up pornography? You don't have to ask the question. You say, yes, Lord. In my struggle. Not a debate as to whether we're going to do this thing. Yes, Lord. To be a Christian is to say, I'm not my own. I'm bought with a price. Wherever He follows. No matter what the cost. And there we see Elisha standing as a beacon to us. To be a follower of Jehovah. Oh yeah, it was dangerous. Life. He could have Jezebel on his throat. Your life will be like the life of one of those prophets of Baal by this time tomorrow. You got 24 hours, Elijah. It could have been as well Elisha. Yes, Lord. That's what it means, brothers and sisters, friends, to be a Christian. A master. You say, why would anybody in their right mind submit somebody else's will? Well, I use this illustration, and I hope you get it. I'm kind of a Star Trekkie when I was younger, and a Star Wars when I got a bit older. You just think of here's Luke Skywalker bowing before this evil emperor. Yes, Master. Doing the will of this evil emperor. What's wrong with that guy? Like that? To be a Christian? Not on your life. Because we are following not an evil emperor, but the gracious King and Lord of all, who is merciful. How do you know He's merciful? Because He sent His own Son. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes on Him would not perish, have everlasting life. That's the God that Elisha followed. That's the God who demands your obedience and allegiance. It's not foolish. The only wise thing to do to come to such a God and trust Him. Second lesson we learn is we need to pray for and plead with God that He would give us more servants like Elisha, who are ready to go wherever the Master calls. Now, when I was young, when I was a college student, I was in a Christian campus fellowship, and we had a number of men my age who wanted to follow Christ, and a number of them went right out of college into seminary. And they're not all following, they're not all in the ministry at this day. I hope they're all following Christ still, but there was this determination. There was a zeal, there was a desire to follow Christ, to serve Christ. When I came to the Philippines in 1984, there were a number of young men my age who wanted to serve, who are in the ministry still today, my peers. And we asked, where are the young men today? We're nothing special. We're not putting ourselves up on a pedestal by any means, because we recognize our own failures and faults. But where are the young men who have anything like a desire to sacrificially serve Christ out of love for Him who first loved us? With hearts aflame, who love. Why? Because He first loved us. Him who washed us and cleansed us from our sin with His blood and put a new song in our hearts. Where are they like that? Young men who are ready to stand up to a whole flock of prophets of Baal. And there they are in their multitudes, dancing with their fervor and their zeal, cutting themselves and saying, "Oh, Baal, hear us." And here's Elijah, the prophet of Jehovah, one guy. "Lord, hear me. Let these people know that You are God, that I am Your servant. I have done all these things at Your word. Oh Lord, let them know You're God." I fell. Where are the young men? Oh, God may not call you to be a pastor, a missionary. God may call you to be an oxen follower. Will you do it for His glory? With warm zeal to serve Him in His church and whatever. Where are the young women willing to serve? Now, I'm not talking about women becoming pastors or even missionaries to the point of, preaching, and that's of course not the point. But serving Christ. The role. Where are you? Let us plead with God to raise up another generation. We are fewer here tonight than when I first came to this conference. Where is everybody? Plead with God. Lord, send fire from heaven. Work in our generation. Raise up more who will be the replacements for us old men. You want to see the churches full and growing and expanding and more churches planted. We need to plead with God. Only God can do that. Plead with God. But then lastly, as we close, where are the Christians? You don't merely need servants in the ministry. Plead with God that He would save. Plead with God that He would bring up another generation of sincere, gracious, godly Christians, young men and women in our churches. Let's plead for the next generation. Remember old Elijah? We read earlier in the chapter, and he's there pouting at the juniper tree. And he says, "Oh Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers." It's things are going from bad to worse, and we might as well just curl up in a hole and die. It's all over. And I know us older guys and women don't feel that way, but sometimes it can be a little discouraging. God comes and says to him, "Elijah, what you doing here? Why are you in this pouty puss attitude of just saying, woe is me, it's so bad and it's all over? I've got 7,000 not bowed the knee to Baal. And there's a remnant in Israel. I got work to do. I'm not finished yet. We're not closing the book. We're not flushing it down the tubes." We're praying for the next generation. Because God's work is not finished with our generation. It's not going to end. The book's not going to close here and say, well, that was it. And it's not that just we're tooting the horn of our little group, the Reformed Baptists, the only people God has on the earth. It's not the case. We believe that we have hold of substantial truths that need to be proclaimed. Where's the next generation who are going to love these things deeply and proclaim them faithfully? Pray for the next generation. Pray for God to work. Well, as I close, I ask those of you here who are not Christians. You know you're not. Why not? That's a crutch. That's old stuff. Karl Marx tried to say stuff like that. It's just not true. Where do you see bold people? William Carey wasn't leaning on any crutch. India. No, it's not a crutch. It's a fire. Dear young people, there's a fire in hell too. You need a Savior. He's a gracious Savior. He's worth following, like Elisha did. You've come to know Him. See, this God of Elisha, His name is true. My God saves. He can save you to the uttermost. Let's pray. Father, we thank you like Elisha. We thank you for his parents who prepared him. We thank you for his readiness by your grace to respond to this call to serve. We thank you for his faithfulness even in following the oxen and laboring in the calling that you had given him before he was called to the ministry. Oh, how we plead that you would raise up another generation of faithful pastors who will be willing to count the cost and pay the price and face any sacrifice, even in a day of apostasy, even when things are hard, and even when you get names called at you, and even when people turn their back on you, and even when your own servants seem to be worthless. Oh God, we plead that you would raise up another generation of faithful preachers, faithful servants. But we plead even more that you would raise up another generation of faithful Christians in whatever calling, in all callings that are lawful callings. Oh God, hear our cry. We long to see your churches full. We long to hear 1,000 tongues proclaiming Jehovah's praise, our sweet Redeemer's praise. Hear our cry and do what only you can do. We cannot do these things. We see our own weakness and inability and frailty. Nothing difficult for you. Hear us as we plead it in Jesus' name. Amen.